Look, a startup-ready environment basically means the government isn't actively trying to suffocate you with paperwork like it's a hobby. When government believes in you, investors also suddenly start believing in you. So government money equals investors saying, oh great, someone else took the first bullet, let's go. It's like when your mom says you look handsome, nobody cares, but when a stranger says it, boom, validation.
Welcome to the very first episode of 2080 Ventures podcast, where we bring together the voices of entrepreneurs, angel investors, and venture capitalists to discuss different factors, challenges, and opportunities in the current startup ecosystem. Today, we're going to discuss how the role of public policy, government grants, and state-backed venture funds plays a huge role in the startup ecosystem in Asia, its challenges and opportunities. I'm your host, Sunguech. Today, we're joined by Timur Daudpota, who is the founding partner of 2080 Ventures. So welcome, Timur, to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me and looking forward to doing this podcast with you.
So, Timur, with your experiences of working at 500 with over 800 startups and running startup ecosystems in various regions around the world, especially when we're talking about Asia, with 2080 Ventures actively running startup launchpad in Korea, in Saudi Arabia, Cambodia, and Jordan, you get to see the direct impact of public policy and government grants on founders, investors, and VC. So my first question to you, which we're going to start off a little bit with a broad question. What does it mean to have a startup-ready policy environment?
Look, a startup-ready environment basically means the government isn't actively trying to suffocate you with paperwork like it's a hobby. Officials who don't look at you like you're a criminal as soon as you start a company and they're waiting for tax dollars to come in. What it counts is it's all about tax breaks, not only for founders, but also investors. Quick company registration and not a 72-step licensing process, right? Also, what's really important is a place where you can build a company without needing uncle in the ministry, right? So let's talk about examples. So if we're thinking about examples, a good example would be Estonia, where you can register a company within 20 minutes and it's incorporated in a fast track fashion. You have regulatory environments like sandboxes. So think about MSA in Singapore or Bahrain, where you have fintech data. You can start creating products and testing to see if it's working or not. Another good example would be IP ownership. So IP ownership rules that don't trap investors inside universities. So Japan changed that in 1999, and boom, there was a huge surge of startups that exploded during that time.
Your examples are really great. With these policies and regulations such as licensing process and tax break and IP ownerships, my follow-up question is, how do these type of policies and programs influence investors' confidence or willingness to take risk?
It's simple. When government believes in you, investors also suddenly start believing in you, right? So think about if PIF, if they invest in a company, of course, a lot of people will be backing that startup like crazy, right? So it's like when your mom says you look handsome, nobody cares, but when a stranger says it, boom, validation, right? So government money equals investors saying, oh great, someone else took the first bullet, let's go. So it really de-risks the market, and it also means that investors get a green light, because a lot of investors create to be mavericks and first movers, but they're really waiting for somebody else to take the lead. And that gives the validation for other investors to come in and invest in those startups.
So there are many Asian ecosystems that were built with government support, such as Singapore, where the government entity Enterprise Singapore collaborated with Economic Development EBD and brought over a total of government funding to 1 billion SG dollars to stimulate greater private sector investments in local deep tech startups. There are countries such as Singapore with a great government support, which is so great for startup growth. But as these ecosystems mature, there is a critical tension emerge. When does government stop fueling innovation and start creating dependency?
So if you look at the famous Korean TIPS program, which is built hundreds of startups, but now some founders are optimizing the entire business on how to win the next grant and not win customers. Also, the issue with those policies is that they look for IP registration. So IP registration, if that becomes a KPI, yes, a lot of IPs are being registered, which are in theory look great on paper, but it doesn't really help create businesses, right? So that's one. Malaysia, where you have multiple agencies fund the same startup three times, but nobody asks if the product is actually being used, right? And the other really good example would be in Japan in the 90s, where there was huge R&D budgets that created big, brilliant technology that never left the lab or was commercialized because it wasn't required, right? So you had huge technology, right? So like even now, if you look at it, like Japan is like was so advanced in robotics, but nobody like tried to, okay, let's sell it to the public, or like it didn't do it at the scale which Tesla's trying to do. So that's the tension, right? At what point does this become a cushion so comfortable that founders forget how to fight, right? And I think that's what's happening when you start to seeing like grant chasing instead of customer chasing, startups built for reporting KPIs instead of revenue, incubators full of like grant zombies who've raised like 500K but have like three users at bare minimum. It's sad because it's not gonna change. It's not gonna happen, right? So it's what it is.
You already look at from like a startup like founder perspective. So from an investors or even venture capitalist perspective, like how does this affect them?
Investors are not going to come in, right? So investors tend not to come into these environments. They know that their capital is not safe unless the government gives them the capital to start their funds there. That's fine as well. Maybe there is a unicorn, if ever so. However, investors tend to pull off, right? So you'll see like a lot of great brands not come in and invest in those ecosystems.
So how should startup founders balance independence with growth?
Not saying like government grant is bad at all, right? That's it's not a bad thing, but constantly like when your whole founders personalities apply for grant, burn the grant, then apply for grant again, you're not a founder, you're a professional beggar, right? And let's keep that clear. What you need to do is make sure that you are focused on the customers, focus on things that really matter, and not a glorified grant writer. A lot of the founders that do actually get up money are really good at writing grants, and there are whole industries that have just popped up that take a percentage like 10%, 20% that actually write the grants for founders. And so because the founders are incentivized to make really good paperwork instead of really good products, that's what they do.
That's a really great point. So in places like Singapore, where government actively design and fund startup ecosystem, there are also countries like in Indonesia and Vietnam where founders have to build from the bottom up with little to no government support. So how does that difference shape the founders in terms of scaling their startups or even their mindset? I mean, from your perspective as an investor.
Here's the honest truth, right? Like, if you look at, there are two types of startups that become really successful. There is the beautiful swans, right? And so these swans are like, they went to prep schools. They were going into elite high schools before that. They had parents' capital to take tuition and after school classes. And then you have the other type, which are the ugly ducklings, right? So, and the ugly ducklings are like, who are these guys, right? And so that's the difference, right? So if you're looking at Vietnam and Indonesian founders, these guys are street smart. They build without asking for permission because if they ask, the answer would be no and come back in 3 months, right? So it's better to be just like, there's an American saying, right? Better to ask forgiveness than ask for permission. And so if you look at Singaporean founders, it's complete opposite. They're polished. They know their regulatory pathways before the customers. They optimize for compliance, structure, and scaling. So there's two different mindsets. Vietnam founders who survived the early 2010s internet restrictions became absolute killers, right? So like, look at Indonesia's Gojek, right? It started with the motorcycle drivers messaging through BlackBerry groups. And this is a peak bottom scrappy approach. There's a lot of this now in surprisingly in the Middle East, where founders are solving the problems with WhatsApp messaging, being creative, being street smart even before the product is built. And I think these founders are going to go out to become successful because that's what they want to do. They don't want to rely on governmental funding. They know what it takes to build a startup.
So to follow up on that questions, I mean, when we're talking about the differences between founders that get like government fundings and founders that get little to no like government support and fundings, in terms of the markets, are those in more bottom-up markets more resilient or just taking on more risk because there's less support?
Let's look at Singapore, Korea, and Taiwan. They have a higher startup survival rate, and it's not because that they're good. It's just because their support systems are strong. On the other hand, we have like Indonesia, Vietnam, and Philippines. They have a lower survival rate, but the ones that do survive, they become giants, right? So polished ecosystem means more companies, but a scrappy ecosystem means big winners if they do come out of it.
What do you think are the best ways for the governments to help startups?
Okay, so if I have to make a list, let's say like there's a blunt list. One, make company registration stupidly easy. Give tax incentives without a 200-page form. Fund programs, but do not babysit. Like people who are running it, they are experts. They know what they're doing. So if you're gonna bring in fund managers to run it, or you're gonna bring in accelerators, let them do their thing, and don't micromanage to push a certain companies or certain agenda, which I see a lot happening. To support R&D and early stage risk capital, this is really important in ecosystem. Like a lot of the ecosystems have this policy of preserving money, and they're not very easy on taking risks. So they see startups as a very risky capital. And so government needs to come in and start pushing the agenda, not only to startups to say, okay, here's early risk capital, but also to investors and saying like, okay, we know you don't like risk, but it will be good for you to put 1 to 2% off your allocation into these companies. And I'm not saying put everything, but 1 to 2% is a good site to have. So that way public support can also come in. The other thing is build real talent pipelines, not motivational workshop, right? Talent pipelines are important. A lot of the times, if people are going in and they don't know how to, they're not tech savvy, they're not good at sciences, they don't know how to build, these founders are never going to be successful, right? So what goes into the founder's mind and when they are in universities and when they are in these schools is going to drive the output of what they create for these ecosystems. To stay the hell out of micromanaging startups, like don't create policy after policy. So I'll give you a good example. A really good example is if you look at it, the Chinese drone startups became really successful. And the reason for that is because US came in with a lot of regulations. And that's why China was able to win. So whenever there's something new like EV or rocket technology or AI, just stay the hell out. We don't know what it is yet. Like there are going to be accidents. It's okay, right? Things are going to fail. Like let it play out for God's sakes. And then you can come in with the policies later. But don't create policies even before there's something. And yeah, the last thing is for God's sake, please pay your vendors on time, right? Like a lot of the times people come in and like there are not only in this ecosystem, founders are being created, but a lot of vendors and vendor service providers are being created. And so a lot of times what we'll see is like vendor providers who have new ideas or who want to do something very differently into the ecosystem will not get the chance because government policies make it so that these companies do not come in. They make it so hard. They want the world for very less amount of money. So if you want innovation, you need to create a frictionless highway, no obstacle course, right? So no obstacle courses with inspirational slogans. It doesn't help anyone.
Lastly, for the startups that have little to no government fundings or support, do you have any advice for them?
Think about ways that other people are not looking into. When you are a startup in an emerging market, you tend to look at valuations and companies from the States who are used to getting a large amount of capital. So imagine you are somewhere in Buenos Aires, right? And you want to create the next Uber. To create that and cost of acquisitions, you will need to raise a lot of capital. Being scrappy and understanding is like we have to prove a lot more with a lot less. You need to come up with ideas that reflect the capital and fundraising environment of that region if you are raising locally. If not, I would highly recommend go into markets that are hot like MENA, like United States, where you can actually raise outside funding and then come back and build back home.
Thank you very much, Timur, for your insightful answers. I mean, we have a really great discussion today, and that wraps up today's first episode of 2080 Ventures podcast. And if you find this helpful, make sure to subscribe to 2080 Ventures official YouTube channel, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thank you.